Yeah, it's not a happy day for Washington Nats fans. And I think probably the audience here this morning is impacted by the fact that there are a lot of people who didn't want to get out of bed this morning. What is kind of unusual here and a little bit threatening for someone to come to speak before you is that not only did David grow up in the Chicago area, not only did Admiral Rogers grow up in the Chicago area, Dan Coates has been a lifelong Cubs fan, lived from Indiana, just close by Chicago, married a Chicago girl, and we're trying to play down our excitement this morning, particularly since we're sitting in front of a crowd of Nats fans. We fully understand that, but just remember this: we've been suffering 108 years. Okay, so we know a little bit of your pain, but I do want to say that I felt like I was in a win-win situation last night because spending all these years in Washington, you have to be a Nats fan also, and we got our shot last year. It kind of took the pressure off, so I thought, okay, I can make the switch over to the Nats for the rest of the series, and anyway, it was a game that is going to kind of go down in history as one of the craziest games I've ever seen. All the things you anticipated would happen went wrong on both sides, and one side barely snuck in and survived. I have an easy job this morning with another engagement right on, but I'm going to try to stay a little bit for Admiral Rogers. 702. Which is identified by the intelligence community as really the Holy Grail. I mean, it is the instrument which gives us access into the thinking, the minds, and the actions of adversaries, foreign adversaries, not U.S. citizens, but foreign adversaries that have bad thoughts in their minds relative to the United States and want to do us harm. It has become an indispensable tool by which we can determine and gain information about threats to the United States, about threats to our troops, about weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, about cyber attacks, about any number of things that threaten the American way and the American people. And so the reauthorization of this authority is extraordinarily critical as we move toward the end of this session. Now, we are fully aware of the fact that there are those who think that this is an overstep, that it invades their privacy, that it might not square up with the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. But we have taken such extraordinary steps to ensure that we respect and that we honor and that we do everything we can to provide Americans their constitutional rights, their rights of privacy, and at the same time have in place something that is not designed in any way and has multiple protections to prevent us from impeding on that privacy. But yet is a critical element of our ability to keep, frankly, to keep Americans safe. Admiral Rogers has lived with 702 for his 3 years as Director of National Security Agency. He's going to explain to you in explicit detail just what it does do and what it doesn't do. He's going to talk to you about how the intelligence community values and respects the rights of Americans and their constitutional rights and their privacy, but also the steps that have been put in place, both legislatively and procedurally, in terms to honor our commitment to that protection. He's going to talk to you about the successes that we've had, the incidents that we have unclassified for the purpose of letting the American people know the value of this particular authority that we have. And so it not only affects those of us here in the United States trying to keep our families safe, trying to keep our country from harm, but it also affects our foreign partners and allies. As I've traveled throughout Asia, Europe, the Middle East, virtually without exception, my counterparts in the intelligence agencies of these various countries have said, thank you for providing us the information that allowed us to stop a plot, to intercept a plot, to keep our people safe. Several have said, not only hundreds, but perhaps thousands of our citizens have survived a potential attack on their lives because of the information that you have derived from 702 and provided to us, our allies. So this is not just about America. It's about the civilized world that's trying to deal with the barbaric attempts of many and the malign attempts of many throughout the world to undermine democracies wherever they lie, and those that are peacekeeping countries that are at the targets of those who want to target them. And so it has value beyond our shores. As all of you know, this collection is not against Americans. It is against the law. We also know that there's some misunderstandings out there, some misperceptions of what the law does and what the law doesn't do, what our procedures do and what they don't do. There's mischaracterization. Some of it, I think, is just a misunderstanding. They haven't seen the facts. They haven't had the opportunity to dive into the program, to see what we've done to try to protect the privacy rights of Americans. Others, I frankly want to say, I think just simply hold to a whole different thought about the role of government in keeping Americans safe and about the breaches that they perceive. You need to know that the error rate on this, and error is, and I want to emphasize the word unintended error rate. A report forgot to be signed, it was delivered a day late. Unintended errors that have taken place throughout this program, and to keep track of every one of these, we release all this information to the public, to the oversight committees, and the error rate is significantly below 1%. I can't find another agency in government that has an error rate of 0.43, 0.51 each year that comes in unintended. Throughout the life of this authority that we have not found one intentional breach, one intentional misuse of this authority. That is a record that I think speaks to the care in which we impose the people that work through these processes and how much they care about doing this the right way. Admiral Rogers will give you information as to how this procedure is executed. We have reached out to members of the Congress, both in the Senate and in the House, saying, don't take the Director of National Intelligence word for it. Don't take Admiral Rogers, head of NSA's, word for it. Come out to the agency. Walk down on the floor. Don't sit through a PowerPoint. Go down and talk to the young men and women, exceptional people that are working in this agency, and talk to them. What are you doing? How do you do this? What about this? What about that? We have brought members out there that have done a total 180. The misperception of what they've had based on some of the narratives that are being spun out there by those who want to take away this authority is totally contradicted by the facts. Unfortunately, some members have turned down my multiple requests to either escort them or to provide technical information to them in their office or to take them out to Fort Meade, take them over to the FBI so that they can not walk into the director's office, but walk down on the floor where this is being executed and look and be with the people who are exercising these authorities to keep us safe. And so we are up against those who, frankly, just have a total mistrust in government. They just simply refuse to think that government has any interest in keeping, in adhering to the Fourth Amendment or keeping their privacy. I think I now want to say, maybe close with this. Admiral Rogers, former director at the NSA, in a public hearing before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, talking about the authorities that we have and trying to determine who the bad guys are and how we can prevent them from connecting with either operatives here or operatives from overseas, and having the information to intercept these types of attacks on the United States. I asked the question to Keith Alexander. I said, General Alexander, I said, if these authorities are removed, if they're not reauthorized, if they're compromised to the point where it compromises our ability to determine who's trying to do bad stuff on us, what is the ultimate result? In 3 words, he said, the ultimate result is Americans will die. And that is a stark reality which we're looking at. The last thing, the thing that we absolutely cannot do, is compromise this program to the point where we're back before 9/11. We learned a lot of lessons from 9/11. The 9/11 Commission, bipartisan, gave us recommendations as to what we need to do to prevent that horrendous day from ever happening again on American soil. And we know that's a tall challenge, but unless we commit ourselves to do everything we legally can, supported by the courts, supported by every court decision that has been raised, supported by evidence of care and trust in doing it the right way, supported by all the transparency, all the information we provide to the American people in terms of what we're doing, we have to succeed this year. It is the agencies, all 17 of us, #1 priority is the authority that is absolutely essential if we're going to deal with the world, not as we'd like it to be, but the world as it is. And that world as it is looking to provide great harm to the American people. With that, let me introduce Admiral Rogers, who is more steeped in this issue than a whole combination of the rest of us. But he can bring, I believe, very compelling reasoning and evidence of why this program is so critical. Admiral?
We're absolutely delighted to have you here. You've had 3+ distinguished years now at NSA, building on an extraordinarily distinguished career that takes us, the two of us, back probably a good 15 years as I've watched you progress and lead different organizations from Pacific Command to the J2, the intelligence element at the Department of Defense, and then at NSA, and thank you for your service. His biography is obviously available online, and so we'd like to really just jump in on the questions and issues of the day that we're here for. Give the audience, if you will, sort of a baseline of what 702 is, before we kind of jump into then some of the issues.
Glad to, and if I could, not only is today Chicago on a great day because the W is flying again over Wrigley Field, but also for those of you who might be veterans of the United States Navy, October the 13th is the 242nd birthday. So,
yes,
to my fellow veterans in the Naval Service, happy birthday. Now, with respect to, so how would I describe 702? So, 702 first, how did you come up with this number? It is the section of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, it's Section 702, that specifically provides the legal and statutory authority for us to collect overseas against non-U.S. persons for a specific set of purposes. That law has been in place for just under 10 years. First passed by the Congress in 2008, renewed again by the Congress in 2012. And now we find ourselves 5 years later. The statutory authority expires December the 31st, 2017. And so we're now in a legislative, am I
Your
not on?
mic, no, you're not on.
Okay,
It's that high tech.
that's it. Do you get me now? Okay, apologize. And so now we are in another statutory review process. Congress is considering the legislation, which again is currently slated to expire, or sunset is the phrase we use, on December the 31st, 2017. As you heard from the Director of National Intelligence, we are arguing that there is a compelling case to continue the reauthorization of this statutory authority, which has been in place for almost a decade. And that decade-long use of this authority has generated tremendous value for our nation, and we'll talk about in the course of our discussion some of that value, that in the course of that almost 10 years of using this statutory authority, we're very proud of the track record we have of our legal compliance with the law, of the fact that we have been a forthright and honest organization, that when it makes mistakes, it publicly acknowledges those mistakes. It goes to the court, it goes to the Director of National Intelligence, it informs the Attorney General, and it informs our oversight committees in the Congress. I also very much welcome the discussion, because I am the first to acknowledge that it is important for us as a nation that we have a very public, forthright, and direct dialogue about how are we trying to ensure that our government has the tools that it needs to help ensure the security of our nation, while at the same time, it does so within a very specified legal regime, and that legal regime includes explicit protections for the privacy and the observance of the rights of our citizens. It's not one or the other. We are committed to doing both. And so I very much welcome opportunities like this to sit down and have a discussion about what it is, what it isn't, why is it that we feel so strongly that renewing this again is in our nation's best interest, and I look forward to that discussion.
Well, thank you for that introduction that builds on Director Coates's remarks at the opening. He used phrases like saves American lives, again, quoting General Alexander, from several years ago. And the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board placed the percentage of intelligence that's collected at this at over 25%, which we understand at a classified level it could be with greater precision on what that is. But when you weigh the importance of this program in terms of that phrase of keeping Americans safe, and the dependency of giving the decision maker that ability to prevent a terrorist attack or a transfer of weapons of mass destruction material or whatever sort of threat that may come from it. Can you talk a bit about the importance of the program from a standpoint of what NSA does on a daily basis by the men and women at Fort Meade?
Sure. So there's two measures that we look at that lead us to the conclusion that this program is so fundamentally valuable to us. The first is both the uniqueness of the insights that it generates, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And the second is the quantity of the insights that it generates. So as you've heard, 702 generates a significant, of the total reporting of the National Security Agency, which is generated to provide policymakers with insights to help generate better policy for our nation, to help military commanders to be better informed and in a position where they can make smarter and better operational choices, to help inform the cybersecurity of our nation. This statutory authority, Section 702, and the information it generates is both incredibly unique and significant in its following. Your David quoted number, I'm not going to confirm or deny it, I'm only going to say it is a significant percentage of our reporting. Which is another point I try to make, and I have said this to the Congress. If we lose this statutory authority, there is no alternative way, let me repeat that, if we lose this statutory authority, there is no alternative way that I am aware of to account for it via other means. can't replace, if we lose this legal authority, I can't replace this information via other collection sources, via other legal means. That's how unique, in some cases, the data that we get from this is. That data, if you will, that insight has enabled us to do things like understand enemy movements on the battlefields in Afghanistan, enabled us to reroute U.S. convoy movements, U.S. troop concentrations, to alert U.S. service members serving in Afghanistan of imminent threat directed against them. So it has saved lives in the battlefield in Afghanistan. This same authority and the information that it generates for us has enabled us to generate unique insights on the transfer of weapons from certain nation states around the world to other parties who would do harm to our nation, as well as those of our friends and allies. The information generated as a result of this statutory authority has enabled us to take key ISIS leaders off the battlefield. We have been very public in Haji Aman, who is one issue that we have declassified. He was the #2 commander in ISIS, and between 2014 and 2016, we, the U.S. government writ large, have spent almost 2 years trying to locate him with the view of removing him from the battlefield in Iraq and Syria. We actually, as a nation, had posted a multi-million-dollar bounty or reward for information leading to his arrest or death. Despite 2 years of that, we had been unable to locate him. Because of the data we derived through 702, we got our first hint, and I apologize, I won't go into all the specifics. I'm going to try number 4 now,
Yeah.
huh? The light says it's on. Okay, well, you guys keep trying to come up with a common methodology. Apologize for the rest of you. So this same statutory authority enabled us to take Haji Aman off the battlefield. As I said, the #2 individual in ISIS, we had been looking for him between 2014 and 2016. This was one hardened, intelligent, smart adversary. He had a sense of how he worked. He knew that the techniques collectively, he moved without a regular signature. He was a very intelligent adversary who constantly was adapting how he communicated and where he moved. Because of 702 authority, we're able to gain insight to an individual associated with him. That led us to then track this adversary and tie him to Haji Aman. We then put Haji Aman under surveillance through our U.S. military forces on the battlefield. We attempted to actually capture him. Unfortunately, he decided he wanted to resist capture, and he was killed in a firefight in 2016. Had it not been for 702 authority, after literally 2 years of trying to find him, after an extended period of a multi-million-dollar bounty on his head, it was only because of 702 generated authority, or insight, if you will, that we're able to ultimately find him. It's because of the data generated under this statutory authority that we have been able, if you look at attacks in Europe in the last 6 months, I won't go into specifics, but we have been able, in the aftermath of those attacks, to take data provided to us by our European counterparts, to use the information that we generate under 702 to go back to them and say, we have proof that the individual who executed this has ties to ISIS. There's additional people involved in this effort. Here's who they are. And in fact, in at least one case, and they are trying to mask the identity of a couple of these people, and here's their strategy because they want to use them again in the future. They're hoping you're not going to catch them, and they want to use them in the future to carry out attacks in Europe, and that was in one particular scenario in one particular country. The insight generated under this lawful authority has also enabled us to achieve significant insights from a cybersecurity perspective. We would not be able to generate some of the insights we've been able to do that supported the U.S. intelligence community assessment from 2016 with regards to the Russian activity. We have not been able to, we would, without this authority, not have the same level of insight with respect to cyber actions around the world, both directed against our neighbors as well as directed against the U.S. structure. So I hope one of the takeaways when we talk to people about, well, why is this so valuable? It's you get a sense for, boy, how unique this is. The fact that it generates insights that have direct actionable impact. This isn't just theoretical. We are taking people off the battlefield. We are helping our partners take people off the battlefield in terms of arresting those terrorists and those who would do harm to their fellow citizens in other countries. We are able to help stop nations from moving arms illegally to other parties. We're able to generate huge insights in terms of cybersecurity. So I just try to highlight to people, this is why 702 is so valuable. It's this deep, unique information that we can't get via other means, and it's the volume of this information and its global applicability that makes it such a powerful tool for us. That's why we feel so strongly, hey, we believe it is in our nation's best interest to continue with the statutory authority currently resident in 702, that we think this is in our nation's best interest. We would also argue, if you look over our track record over the last 10 years, I don't pretend for 1 minute that we are perfect. I'm proud to call myself the director of NSA and to be a part of a team of incredibly motivated men and women who work incredibly diligently to both defend this nation, but to also safeguard the privacy and the rights of its citizens. And if you had the chance to sit down and talk to some of those men and women, it is just amazing to me, the self-discipline, the focus on both mission and ensuring the security of our citizens. It's not one or the other to them. It is, sir, we gotta do both. Sir, we gotta do both. It's one of the reasons why, as you heard from the DNI, we routinely offer, and many members have taken us up on the offer, please come out to Fort Meade and don't talk to me. Don't sit through a PowerPoint briefing. Sit down and watch the men and women that are actually doing this work. Ask them, well, how do you gain access to this information? What kind of information is it? Can you walk me through what are the protections you've put in place? Can you help me understand your training? Can you help me understand the controls? Hey, who can access this data? How do you use this data? Why should I feel comfortable that this data is not being misused? That in some way you are using this to attempt to undermine the privacy and the rights of our citizens. That is a dialogue that we welcome. And with that, I apologize, David.
No, that's a great response to a follow-on question that I have. If I read sort of the trending out there in terms of criticisms to the program, it's not so much at the front end of what you described as disruptive, being used for disruptive purposes in attacks overseas and that sort of thing. But the incidental or inadvertent collection on U.S. persons. I think it'd be useful if you could walk us through in terms of the oversight on that particular issue by first baselining what does it mean to collect on U.S. persons inadvertently and incidentally because of the communications that are captured throughout the 702 program.
Right.
And that would be helpful.
So we acknowledge in the course of executing 702, we are going to run into U.S. persons. We acknowledge that. That is the nature of the global telecommunications backbone. It's the way this global system that we take for granted, that we all use with our personal handheld devices, with our own at home, if you're a landline user and via other communications, we acknowledge that. So one of the things that we've tried to build into this is a series of protections that are designed to say, so if you do encounter U.S. persons, what are you doing to make sure that that information isn't used inappropriately? So the first thing we do is very upfront. The law does not allow broad, unfiltered collection. The law is very specific. It first tries to protect U.S. persons by saying you can only collect overseas. You can only collect overseas outside the United States. The second vehicle in the law that's designed to protect U.S. persons is that the law is very explicit. You cannot knowingly target U.S. persons via this authority. That is illegal. You can't use this authority to knowingly target U.S. persons. So that's the second protection that's in place. It's very explicit to us. The third protection that's in place within the law itself is the fact that the law, this part of it is actually classified, but the law is very specific. It defines a specific set of purposes that we can collect against. So what does that mean? The law does not allow us to just indiscriminately overseas against non-U.S. persons collect anything we want. The law specifies you can only collect overseas against non-U.S. persons for 3 very specific stated purposes. And it's classified, so I'm not going to go into the specifics, but the law is very specific. So there's a series of protections built into the legal framework itself that's designed to stop the intelligence community from being able to collect anywhere it wants, can't collect in the United States, against any individual, U.S. person, can't do that. And it's designed to stop us from just indiscriminately collecting anything overseas.
So let me ask you on that, is just so for the audience, the word selector is used. What does that mean, a selector in the context of these 3 legal constraints on the collection?
So that's one of the additional protections that's put in place. We collect by querying this data provided under legal authority by U.S. service providers. We collect based on a specific set of criterion. In slang, you'll often, as you heard David say, you'll hear the term selector from us. What is a selector? It can be an email address. It can be a name. Those are the most common. Another protection that's in place, we have to be able to show that those selectors, those search criteria, we have to show, be outside the United States, not be a U.S. person, and be associated with one of these 3 specific categories. For every single search criterion we select, we have to meet that criterion. Another protection we put in place, no one single individual at NSA is authorized to make a collection request. We actually, first, our analysts have to prove that it's an overseas target, it's a non-U.S. person, and it's for one of the 3 stated purposes. Then we have that request independently reviewed by 2 other senior analysts, so that there's 3 individuals internally within NSA who look at a query before it even goes to outside NSA to actually be met. If I could, let me just finish the idea of some of the protections that are in place, because I would tell you 702 has the most oversight and the most checks and balances of any statutory legal authority that NSA uses to execute its missions. Some of the other kinds of oversights and checks and balances that are in place. Every year, the U.S. government, through the Department of Justice and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, has to put in writing to the FISA court, so how are you going to use this law for the next year? What are the controls that you are going to put in place to ensure that you're collecting in accordance with the law, that you then, we call them minimization procedures. How are you protecting the data that you then collect? Talk to me about what training are you doing for your people, and what oversights and controls do you have in place to ensure that the law is being fully complied with. We have to put that in writing to the FISA court every year. In addition to that, once the court is comfortable, it then allows the U.S. government to issue a series of directives, and the directives are very specific, that go to the providers that say, so you will provide the U.S. government the following information for the following purposes using the following criteria. And that gives the companies the legal basis upon which to comply with the government's request for information. In addition to all that, we have oversight by both the DNI and the Attorney General's team. We are spot checked every 60 days. Every collection request we make is independently reviewed by the DNI team and the Department of Justice team. We have to inform our congressional oversight about what we're doing. We were reviewed by the PCLOB, for example, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board reviewed the program in 2014, came back and said, you are fully statutory compliant, and in fact, we're very impressed with the oversight and control mechanisms that you have put in place. In addition to those things that I've already talked about, we use our Inspector General, we use our Office of Compliance internally to do other checks independently. Again, so one of the takeaways I hope is very structured, multiple checks and balances, and multiple organizations involved in independently checking what's going on. So it's not just us acting as our own policemen, so to speak. It's external organizations also looking at what we do in addition to what we do. In addition, we have a series of protections in place then, so once we get this information, who has access to it? How is it queried? How is it used or published in the form of reports? All of those additional controls are in place. And for example, it doesn't matter how junior you are, from the junior-most employee to a four-star admiral who is the director of the National Security Agency, any one of our employees, to include me, who has access to 702 generated data, for example, must take an annual written test. I take that annual written test. There's a training program, and then you have to take a written test to certify that you understand the legal framework and the processes that we have put in place. And every single individual in our organization who has access to that data is required to do that. And as I said, I take that test, and I study for it just like everybody else, because I take my responsibility, as do the men and women of NSA. There's a reason why we do this. We want our citizens to feel comfortable that, boy, there really seems to be a measure of oversight. There seems to be a measure of control. There's a regime in place to make sure that this is just not unilaterally or indiscriminately used as a vehicle to generate information that might in any way abuse the privacy or rights of our citizens. And then on top of all that, there is a statutory requirement for us when we find problems or errors, we must report them. That's in addition to all the independent reviews. There's a requirement for us to make sure we report. So for example, we have publicly acknowledged that we have stopped doing what we call upstream about collection. Why? Because as we were walking through this process, as we do every year, one of the technical solutions that we had put in place was not working with enough accuracy. We went to the court and said, hey, look, the technical solution we put in place is not working fully as compliant as we designed it to be. We want the court to be aware of that. We physically notified them, and we have to notify the court in writing. And then after a review, I sat down with the team and said, look, I'm just not comfortable. I don't think that the technical solution, I don't have enough confidence in it. So we're going to stop this. Rather, we're going to recommend to the DNI and the Attorney General that we stop this collection, because I don't want to do it, even though I acknowledge in stopping it, we acknowledged we are going to lose intelligence value. There is an operational implication here. But such is the importance to us of our ability to show to the outside world that we not only are fully compliant with the law, but we understand its intent. And among its intent is to ensure the privacy and the rights of our citizens are not violated. And therefore, because we had concerns, we stopped. So I try to highlight that to people as we're just not this indiscriminate, uncaring. It's just about grabbing all the information we can. That's not the way we work. Don't get me wrong. Our mission is to use this statutory authority in a legal way to generate insights as to what adversaries, opponents, and those who would potentially do harm to our nation, what they're doing out there. I don't pretend otherwise for 1 minute. That's what this is all about. But it's also about ensuring we're doing it in an appropriate way.
Not to belabor the issue, but since none of us generally start our communications, I, David Shedd, U.S. citizen, and then proceed to write, talk accordingly. I want to come back to the U.S. person collection then, with all those layers, and appropriately so, of oversight that NSA is under, both inside the organization as well as under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court that oversees it, the DNI, the PCLOBS report that, as you mentioned. Let's come back to the U.S. person piece of it. What happens when either there's a presumed U.S. person that's been collected on, and then what is the oversight? So this is more the other half of the equation of protecting the privacy and liberty. You have the data. What happens with that either presumed or known U.S. person data that you have?
So if we become aware of, we have come in contact with a U.S. person and the data we've collected, we do a couple of things. First, we ask ourselves, is there a threat to life here? Is there something we've uncovered that suggests this American person in some way is under threat or harm? Now, you might look and say, well, what does that mean? That gets to things like kidnappings around the world. That gets to things like hostage situations. We'll look to see, hey, is there something that suggests that there's threat to life here against this U.S. person? The second thing we'll ask ourselves is, have we stumbled into anything that potentially is criminal? If that's the case, we then notify law enforcement. Hey, we've stumbled into something that we believe may be criminal, but we are not a law enforcement organization. We're an intelligence organization, so we are not the ones best positioned to make that determination. The final thing we'll do is ask ourselves, so is there foreign intelligence value here? Have we stumbled onto something that involves foreign intelligence value? And let me walk you through what we do then if the answer is yes or no. If the answer is no to all those questions, no threat to this U.S. person's life, no sense of criminal connection, we believe that there is no foreign intelligence value, we purge the data. We get rid of it. Because again, it doesn't meet the lawful intent of the law, so we purge the data if the answer is no to those three questions. If the answer is yes, then we will retain the data, and then we put a series of additional protections in place, like, so if there's foreign intelligence value, and we decide we are going to use this to report, to generate the knowledge that we will put in the form of a report and share with our customer set. The next protection we put in place is we use what we call masking. We don't use a name. It'll say U.S. person 1, U.S. person 2. So in the course of a conversation, U.S. person 1 was referred to, or U.S. person 1, for example, was involved in. So we mask. We try to hide the identity. That identity can be a person. It can be, because the definition of U.S. person legally for us is much broader than just an American citizen. It's not just an American citizen. It's anyone lawfully in this nation. It's a U.S. incorporated company. It's an association of individuals who predominantly are associated with the United States. There's a whole set of categories about what, quote, is a U.S. person for us. It's just much broader than, oh, all you guys care about is U.S. citizens. No, our protections on the U.S. person side are much broader than that. So we put this additional protection in place about masking. We hide the identity. So we're generating intelligence value, but we're not compromising the identity of the U.S. person. In some instances, where, for example, that U.S. person is a widely known, very public figure, and quite frankly, it becomes very obvious about who they're talking about, we'll use the name, because part of ours is if you're in, a very visible position, it's a little different. So we'll do that. And then we have a series of processes that are in place, and you've often, some of you have heard this of late, the idea of unmasking. So what is this unmasking thing? So masking and unmasking are associated with our reporting, not with collection authority. 702 is a collection authority. It enables us to access information overseas against non-U.S. persons for three specific purposes. Masking and unmasking are processes we put in place that it doesn't matter what the statutory authority is. Did I get this data under 702? Did I get this data under some other lawful? Because we have a series of laws that authorize what we do. Just as we mask to protect the identity of that U.S. person, we also have what we call an unmasking process, where an authorized individual can request in writing the identity of the U.S. person for several purposes. Number one, it has to be something associated with the execution of their professional duties. It can't be, I'm really curious. I'm reading this report and I see it refers to U.S. person 1, U.S. person 2, U.S. person 3, and it just seems like a really interesting report. Boy, it would just be neat to know who these three individuals are. You can't do that. That's not enough. Our process is it has to be on the basis of your job. You need this information because of the execution of your official duties. Secondly, the next criteria we put in place is, and in your written request, you must also show us that you need this to understand this report. It's not just because it's interesting. It's not just because you have a valid need to know, but without the specific information, you can't understand the report. So what are some examples where we'll unmask? Companies. Cybersecurity. So we'll report that U.S. Company 1 was hacked by the following country. Here's how they got in. Here's where they are. Here's what they're doing. Part of our responsibilities on the U.S. government side is the duty to warn. So how do you warn U.S. Company 1 if you don't even know who U.S. Company 1 is? So one of the reasons we do unmasking is, so for example, we can take protective action to ensure this information is provided to the appropriate individuals. We keep a written record of every one of those requests. They are done in writing. They require the individual making the request by name. We don't, that's something that's changed over time as we've continued to try to ask ourselves, so how do we keep improving? One of the things we've said is the request has to come from an individual, not an organization. It can't be just the CIA wants to know or NSA wants to know. It's got to be, or the National Security Advisor wants to know. It's got to be a specific named individual. Because again, we want a record of everything and we want to understand why. And we've been able to reproduce and provide that information, to our legal oversight. When they ask, hey, walk us through this process, and we're able to go back. Here's how it's done. Here's the rules that are in place. Here's the written documentation. We can provide all that. We can show you the report. We can show you what's provided. The last thing with respect to this unmasking process is when we unmask an identity, we don't unmask it to every person who got that report. Only the entity that made the request that we validated. And then finally, when we do unmask it and we reveal the identity, we also remind that individual, you have a legal responsibility to ensure this information is appropriately protected the same way the original report was. Just because we're revealing this name to you because you are asking for it because of the valid execution of your duties, and you need this to help understand the intelligence value of this product and to potentially take action as a result, we are also very adamant and remind them that doesn't mean that you can then share that information with anyone else. The same protections that are in place for the report remain in place. You cannot share this with others that we haven't approved. And then, and that process to me is all separate from leaking, which is the unauthorized disclosure of classified information.
Which is a crime.
Right, regardless of purpose, that is a crime. Now, that's different from whistleblowing. And remember, whistleblowing is a legal protection that's put in place. It's legally defined. There's a series of specific purposes and protections. But leaking, the indiscriminate or the providing of classified information to others who neither have the clearance, have the need to know, and who have not met any whistleblowing protection criteria, that's a crime.
Well, I hope that in the debate that's ensuing on the extension of 702, there is this distinction made on the issue of masking and unmasking, because there is talk out there that combines the two things, and I think it's erroneous.
And I think both are very valid. Don't get me wrong, both are very valid conversations.
Sure, absolutely. In closing, you talked about the upstream collection and what by inference was where the technology was and that. With this ever-changing world in the area of technology and how it's moving at warp speed in terms of this, can you project into the future a bit where this is all going from a technological standpoint and the challenges? And then how does Section 702 fit into that as technology evolves? As we had FISA, really that was very dated at one point and had to be renewed to meet the needs and requirements of the modern age, I might even say, from the 1970s. How do you see that? And we'll close with that question.
Because it's interesting. The current legal structure was created and amended over time because of technology. In 1978, when the FISA Act is first passed, the state of technology at the time is largely copper-based phone. It was one of the primary communication means. So we put
a really long cord right in the kitchen.
And we put a series of protections and a legal regime in place, and thus the FISA Act of 78 is born. Then 30 years later, in 2008, it's post 9/11, we're into copper-based communication systems. Now we're into the world of the World Wide Web, mobile communications. So the technology has changed. The target environment has changed significantly. And so FISA, the current act is created in 2008, almost 10 years ago, to try to come to grips with that. How do we address technology that has changed in the 30 years since this law was first created? And how do we try to adjust the changes in some of the target behaviors we're seeing? Hey, this is post 9/11. We're in a terrorist fight on a global scale. And so thus is born the current law that we deal with now, almost 10 years later. So as I look to the future, so how do I see this evolving over time? The first question is, boy, I don't have an easy crystal ball answer for you. And I'm often asked this by our oversight committees appropriately in Congress. And the point that I make to them is, I don't know what the future necessarily looks like. The commitment I make is, as we see changes in technology, as we see changes in target behavior, as we see the relevance of 702 changing over time, I will both provide that feedback to our oversight so they're aware of it, and we will work with others to ask ourselves, so what potentially, if any, are the changes that we need to make over time? Because I'm the first to admit this, as I've said, over the 30+ years that the FISA regime has been in place, it has evolved and adapted. The legal framework and the authorities that have been granted have changed over time. And I expect that that will be the case in the future, just given the nature of the global telecommunications environment.
Well, Admiral Rogers, happy birthday for the Navy, of course, and thank you for being with us today. And I think educating the American people is critical on this issue as it goes into this decision on its extension and renewal by the end of the calendar year. And so thank you for the service that you provide and the men and women of NSA in terms of this program and keeping Americans and our friends and allies safe because of how this is used, as Director Coates mentioned, in terms of some of his own engagements overseas as well. So from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for being with us today and giving us this opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Thank you very much. And again, I want to highlight, it's an important conversation. As a nation, we need to be willing to sit down and discuss this. So I welcome opportunities like this. The commitment as a member of the National Security Agency and the broader intelligence community, we are committed to both ensuring the defense of our nation, and while so doing, we're committed to ensuring that the privacy and the rights of our citizens are fully respected. Always comply with the legal regime and protections that are put in place. And when we make a mistake, and sadly, no matter how motivated and how strong and how capable those men and women are, they will make mistakes. So the commitment we make is when we make a mistake, we will stand up, we will acknowledge it, and we will own it. We will work to ensure that we don't repeat it over time. With that, I thank you all very, very much.
We're going to have a 30-minute break before the Director of FBI arrives. Please provide questions that you wish to where's David? And Sarah I think you're somewhere in here, and we'll proceed from there. Thank you.
Test, test, 1, 2.
Well, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to the audience, both here in this room and obviously to the world out there, I think I can say new director still, and get away with that, Chris Wray of the FBI. Director Wray comes from New York City, graduated from Yale University in '89, makes me feel old, earned his law degree from Yale Law School in '92. He then clerked for Judge Michael Lutig of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 4th District. In 1993, he began working in private practice in Atlanta. He began his Department of Justice career in 1997 as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, where he prosecuted a series of cases on public corruption, gun trafficking, and financial fraud. In 2001, he joined the Office of the Deputy Attorney General, where he served as Associate Deputy Attorney General and then Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General with oversight responsibilities spanning the full department. It's clearly a very rich curriculum vitae that makes him very, very appropriate for the job that he holds now at FBI. So without further ado, why don't I just let you make your remarks, and then we will do some questions and answers. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. So thanks, David, and thanks to the Heritage Foundation for putting on this whole program so that we can have a better and more informed discussion about FISA Section 702, which I think is sorely needed. I'm very happy to be here this morning, and I'm extremely fired up to be back in public service at the FBI. As David says, I think I still qualify as new. I still feel new. And I've spent the first 2 months trying to get up to speed on a lot of things, including Section 702 and the reauthorization effort. I've also seen the enormous strides that the Bureau has made in transforming our work in the new reality. I still think of it as new, post 9/11. Following the 9/11 attacks, the Bureau and its partners in the intelligence community and elsewhere systematically worked to tear down walls that had prohibited or dangerously inhibited critical sharing of intelligence across our programs. I know that because I was there. I was there in the days before 9/11. I was in FBI headquarters on the days of the attack themselves. And I was there for the 4 years afterwards. And the fact that we have not suffered another 9/11 scale attack is not just luck. It is the product of an enormous amount of very, very hard work and diligence by thousands of professionals. Most importantly, it's a product of teamwork and information sharing and dot connecting by those professionals in the post 9/11, post-wall world, with dot connecting made possible especially by tools like Section 702. Unfortunately, some of the potential amendments that we've heard about as part of this reauthorization discussion strike me eerily similar to essentially rebuilding walls like we had before 9/11. It's like watching well-intentioned people start positioning bricks, back in the walls again, perhaps growing complacent from the fact that we haven't had another attack. So what I'd like to try to do in my brief remarks today, and then obviously I'd like to have a discussion, is talk first about the current threat landscape, which has evolved and changed since 9/11. Second, the value of Section 702 in helping us stay ahead of those threats. And third, some clarification about what the 702 program is and what the 702 program is not. And last, I want to talk about some of the potential real-world practical impact of some of the proposed changes in the 702 program. So let me start with the current threat landscape. When I left public service in 2005, we were still very much focused on the 9/11 style attacks, the kind of terrorist threat posed by al-Qaeda and groups like that. That threat remains, but since coming back, I've learned very quickly how much the threats have changed and diversified. We now face a serious and constantly evolving threat landscape where travel and technology have blurred the lines between foreign and domestic threats. We still have enemies who are plotting the kind of elaborate mass casualty attacks that we suffered on 9/11, attacks that might take months or even years to plot and plan. But that's not all. New technologies now allow ISIS and others to recruit, radicalize, and direct people worldwide much more easily and more remotely than ever before, including right here in the U.S. Homegrown violent extremists or lone actors who self-radicalize at home with little warning also continue to be a major concern. And we worry that terrorists and others are going to be using, as we've seen in Europe, crude but agile methods of attack, from vehicles to drones, attacks that can be planned much more leanly and with fewer participants and executed in a matter of days or even hours instead of weeks or months. So overall, what that means is we now have a greater volume of arguably more compact threats and much less time to detect and disrupt any one of those potential attacks. So a much shorter flash to bang, as the professionals would describe it. So that's a very thumbnail description of the threat landscape. That volume of threats, combined with fewer dots within each one of those threats to connect, and much shorter and tighter time windows in which to detect them and connect them, puts a huge, huge and obvious premium on agility. So one of the things that I've also learned since coming back is the tremendous value of the 702 program for just that purpose, that is, that agility. As most of you know, after the 9/11 attacks, our government worked very hard to figure out why we had failed before 9/11 to connect the dots. That's a phrase that should be familiar to everyone in the audience. As the 9/11 Commission found, a major problem was our inability to take seemingly disparate pieces of information held by different parts of our government or even sometimes within the same agency and to integrate those different pieces into a coherent picture. Since then, through a lot of hard work and a lot of motivation by a lot of professionals, we've succeeded in changing that dynamic. The value of Section 702 is that it gives us the lawful ability to connect those dots between foreign threats and homeland targets using information that is already within FBI holdings. I want to make sure people understand that. When you hear about the FBI conducting queries, what they're doing is doing database checks against databases of information the FBI already has already lawfully obtained. So query, database check, lawfully obtained information we already have. That's what we're talking about. That information in our databases gives us the agility we need to stay ahead of those threats. There's been some discussion about limiting the FBI's ability to access that database, accessing its 702 collection, which would, I'm telling you now, would create a serious risk to the American public. Every day, the Bureau across the country and indeed across the world receives tips and leads from lots and lots of different sources, from the public, from other agencies, from state and local law enforcement, from our international partners. The tips and the leads are flooding in hourly. That's the good news. The American people rightly expect that we're going to take every one of those tips and leads seriously and figure out whether what that nugget, that fragment of information represents something innocuous or whether that's the key flag of the next attack. To do that, to separate the wheat from the chaff, to figure out which ones are innocuous and which ones are the indication of something really serious at that early stage with that short time window I was describing, we've got to be able to connect the dots from the different pieces we're getting and figure out whether that nugget fits in with something else we have elsewhere that causes that aha moment that's so important. And the queries of the FBI databases, including the 702 database, is the first step in connecting those dots. Those queries help us better understand the information, again, that we've already lawfully collected from a variety of sources through Section 702 and a lot of other means by allowing us to cross-reference the information. And that's what helps us prioritize and work the threats, rather than just randomly working one-off cases. And the only way we can do that is by being able to search our data when we get a tip or a lead. So for that reason, at that early and critical stage, Section 702 is one of the most important tools that we have. So let me be clear, obstacles to conducting those database queries will put the American public at greater risk. Obstacles to allowing us to conducting those queries will put the American public at greater risk. They're going to do that because they will either delay us when time is of the essence in conducting those queries, or worse, in a lot of instances, prevent us from being able to look at all. That's going to blind us to information that is already lawfully in our possession. So let me talk a little bit about what 702 is and what it is not. There's a lot of misconceptions out there, and I'm hoping that our discussion afterwards will help us go into a little bit more detail about some of these. But let me just briefly make a few basic points. First, what Section 702 is. Section 702 is a law that has been passed not once but twice by Congress with strong bipartisan support, first in 2008 and then reauthorized in 2012. Section 702 is constitutional, lawful, consistent with the Fourth Amendment. Every court to consider the 702 program, including the Ninth Circuit, has found that. And a lot of those court holdings, as well as the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, have specifically concluded that those queries I was just describing, the FBI's queries, that practice itself is consistent both with FISA and with the Constitution. So what that means is all this debate about potentially tinkering with 702, it's not the Constitution that's requiring that. That's not driven by the Constitution. The courts have uniformly held that both the program and the way it's being executed are constitutional. So a straight reauthorization of 702 would be fully consistent with the Constitution, including the Fourth Amendment. So bipartisan support, fully constitutional. What else is 702? Section 702 is, as I've described, an essential foreign intelligence collection program for the entire intelligence community, including the FBI. But it is a target authority. By that I mean that the collection is only focused on specific selectors, like a particular email address. And then one last point about what Section 702 is. It is subject to rigorous oversight. Oversight by not just one, not just two, but all three branches of government. And I will tell you from a practical perspective, that oversight is demanding. It can be painstaking. It's certainly resource intensive. But we want to make sure that the program is working the way it should be. So we take that oversight seriously and we respect that and embrace that. But that brings me to what Section 702 is not. It is not bulk collection of anybody, not even foreign persons. We in the U.S. government can't cast a broad net to collect information indiscriminately, and Section 702 doesn't provide for that. It does not permit targeting surveillance on U.S. persons anywhere in the world, whether they're here or abroad. And it doesn't even allow targeting of just any foreigner abroad. Even with foreigners, there has to be a reasonable expectation that the target will receive or communicate specific types of foreign intelligence information. Now, the NSA, and you've heard from Admiral Rogers already, is the lead agency for the targeting part. One thing you might find reassuring is that the FBI only receives collection for a very small percentage of what the NSA does. So it's about 4.3% of the targets that are under NSA collection. But that 4.3% is unbelievably valuable and important to our mission. So let me be clear here. When we run our queries that I've been describing, we're running those against just a fraction of NSA collection, and the NSA collection itself is not bulk collection. And we can get NSA collection only for targets that are relevant to ongoing, full national security investigations. So let me close by making clear that this is not an abstract or theoretical debate that we're having about this tool. This has real-world consequences. Just to give one example, it's a tip under 702 from the NSA that was crucial in helping the FBI stop an attack on the New York City subway system in 2009, and just sort of stop and process what a successful attack on the New York subway system would look like, feel like, sound like. 702 helped us prevent that. Take a different kind of example. 702 helped us reveal the terrorist propaganda of an ISIS member, a guy named Sean Parson, and identified additional members of his network. He was using social media to radicalize and recruit actors for ISIS. And part of his network was encouraging followers online to carry out attacks in Western Europe and right here in the homeland in the U.S. He was even posting the names and addresses of American service members. And I just want to quote from his postings in case there's anybody who misunderstands the seriousness of this. I'm quoting from him. "Kill them in their own lands, behead them in their own homes, stab them to death as they walk their streets thinking they are safe." These are real-world consequences. Those are American servicemen and servicewomen he's talking about there. And Section 702 helped us break that network, identify the people he was in contact with. So given these kinds of potential consequences, I am, as you might imagine, very concerned about some of the kinds of proposals being discussed in this reauthorization debate. Any material change to the FBI's use of Section 702 would severely inhibit our ability to keep the American people safe. I think back to the time that I was in government before, on 9/11, right before 9/11, right after 9/11, and I think about how hard dedicated men and women throughout the intelligence community worked to try to tear down the walls that had prevented us from connecting all the information that might have been able to prevent those attacks. And as I said at the beginning, listening to this debate right now, watching some of the potential ideas that are being floated, strikes me as eerily similar to people, well-intentioned, starting to put bricks back into a wall. Normally, the idea of imposing more restrictions on our ability at the FBI to do our jobs would be based on some kind of constitutional challenge. That's not the case here. As I said at the beginning, every court to consider this program has upheld its constitutionality. So it's not because of the Constitution. Well, why else might somebody want to impose restrictions? Well, maybe in the past there have been times when government has abused its power. So maybe that's a reason to have restrictions. But there's been no evidence of any kind of abuse of power under Section 702, despite all the oversight I mentioned before with 3 branches of government and quite a few years of experience now. So the proposed changes to Section 702 that you're hearing about are not based on a need to somehow make this statute constitutional, either as written or as applied. As I've noted, it already is. These are policy changes based on personal views that people have, again, well-intentioned views, and I respect that, on privacy. But as you can tell, my views are different. I think our responsibility, our role, my duty, the duty of the people at the FBI and in the intelligence community, is that we owe it to the American people to use the full extent of our authorities that are consistent with the Fourth Amendment, and that we shouldn't be creating gaps and limitations in those authorities simply for policy reasons. One of the experiences I had in my prior time in government was meeting with the family members of the victims of 9/11. And I am not going to look the families of future victims in the eye and tell them that there was more that we could have done that was fully constitutional, fully within our legal authorities, but that we simply chose not to. I think Americans rightly expect us to use all of the available information that we have and all the tools that we have that are consistent with the Constitution to combat the threats that we face as a country. The FBI has made enormous strides since 9/11 to make sure that it's doing just that. So I implore Congress to reauthorize Section 702 in its current form so that we can keep using one of the most valuable tools that we have in our toolbox to keep America safe. Thank you for having me here today.
Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for your opening remarks. 10 weeks on the job, you've referred to the changes from the period of the first half of the decade. What's the biggest change that you've seen at the Bureau, just in a general sense, from having been in government, out of government, and now back in 10 weeks in your current position?
Well, I think two of the biggest changes that are particularly relevant to this discussion, but they also happen to be two of the biggest things that I've noticed even independently, are in the roles of intelligence, the integration of intelligence and partnerships. So what I mean by that is the FBI in the 90s and before and into the very beginning of the 2000s was still primarily viewed as a law enforcement agency. The FBI now in 2017, the integration that it has of intelligence into everything it does, its role as a full-blown, respected member of the intelligence community is like night and day to what it was during that period. And that's, I think, in no small part due to the elimination of the wall between law enforcement and intelligence, because it allows folks to understand how the intelligence is being used, what intelligence would be most useful. It's that merging of those two concepts that has made the FBI, I think, so much more effective as an intelligence agency and not just as a law enforcement agency. Second, I said partnerships. I've noticed that while partnerships were always important to the FBI, the degree of collaboration and teamwork between the FBI and the CIA and the NSA, but also state and local law enforcement, our foreign partners, especially the Five Eyes, as they call them, has been a dramatic improvement since during the early 2000s. And I think that's, again, a reflection of the fact that, A, the threats that we face are so cross-border, but also the fact that we're able to communicate and compare notes and exchange information and connect those dots. And so I think the two things that I've noticed the most is progress. Ironically, I would have said that even if we weren't having a discussion of Section 702, actually tie in very well to Section 702 and its importance.
They do, and you mentioned foreign partners. How does the Bureau manage the sharing of information derived from 702 with foreign partners, and at the same time protect, for example, the sources associated with where that's derived from, to enhance, again, not only our protection, but the protection of our friends and allies? So more on the partnership side, since you raised that as one of the big changes, but as it applies to 702.
Well, certainly we exchange information related to Section 702, although a lot of that comes from some of our other intelligence community partners and their interaction with our foreign partners. But even the Sean Parson case that I mentioned, for example, that, a key part of that was being able to exchange information with foreign partners so that there were subjects of interest in that investigation, foreign subjects of interest as well, who were being picked up in other countries and intercepted through that collaboration.
And in the question of reauthorization, I think one of the issues that's going to loom large is this whole notion of 702 collection used for investigations of criminals outside of the national security realm. How do you respond to that in terms of both the oversight and the functional role that you have of ensuring that 702 is applied appropriately and in accordance to the law that Admiral Rogers so eloquently laid out in terms of the checks and balances to it? But this is more on the criminal investigatory side than the intelligence collection for national security.
Well, I think there's been a little bit of myth development in that space. When we talk about sort of the criminal side, I think it's important to distinguish between the tip and lead kind of scenario that I'm describing, which is where Section 702 is so important, and the prosecution end of it, where the information of any sort is being used. Section 702 has not been used for any traditional criminal case as evidence, in a trial or anything like that ever, except in about 10 terrorism prosecutions. So the notion that there are criminal agents using Section 702 to make sort of garden variety criminal cases, that's just myth. It is not happening.
Why has that myth evolved in the public square? That somehow a law enforcement agency that also has an intelligence function, as does the Bureau, and as you appropriately say with the post-9/11 environment, having that intelligence function. How did that myth come about, and how do we sort of beat it back from the public square?
Well, I think I'm reluctant to try to guess as to how people who are just confused get confused. My goal is to try to get them straight. At the access phase, I said there was those two phases. At the tip and lead phase, it's important to think about how information comes in. Person X, a private security guard or a police officer sees somebody at 3 in the morning taking all kinds of pictures of the Key Bridge from all kinds of weird angles. That person who's taking those pictures hasn't committed a crime. The guard who sees it doesn't know what the person is up to. It just seems weird to him. We want that guard, we want that person to call in and say, I saw this was odd. It could be nothing, could be something. Well, we're getting tips like that by the thousands. How do we know that that one is something that really matters? Well, when the agent gets that tip, he runs a query in our databases. And it's not just the Section 702 collection. It's all 120 databases that the FBI has, all in one place. One piece of which is the 702 collection.
4.2.
The 4.3% that we get is in that pool. So the agent runs a query. He's just trying to figure out, what do I have here? If he gets a hit that finds out that the person, let's say the guard gave the license plate, right? And so then you run the license plate and you trace the license plate to a person. So now you're running that person's name through the database. If you find out that that person has been communicating with a known ISIS recruiter, which is the kind of information that we have in our 4.3% of the 702 database, okay, now you've got somebody who's filming the Key Bridge, who's in regular contact with a known ISIS recruiter. Still may not mean that it's an attack, but now we know, whoa, don't let that go slip to the someday pile. We need to deal with that now and take a harder look at it and figure out, how real is this? Take another example. Somebody at some kind of supply store or hardware store sees somebody buying some odd accumulation of some product that could be used in an explosive device, or it could be used for something else. And he thinks the person seems kind of squirrely, so he calls in a tip. We don't know what we have. We don't know whether the person's an American or a foreigner. We don't know whether the person is buying fertilizer for some gigantic lawn he has, or whether he's going to build it into a device. Even if he is going to build it into a device, we don't know whether it's because he's mad at his employer or his ex, or whether he's actually in coordination with some kind of cell. At that initial access phase, the sifting of all these leads, that's when we need to be able to connect the dots. And that's where 702 is so important. We need the person to know, what's the significance of the tip I have? What other dots does this fit with? And as I said before, unlike in the sort of more traditional Al-Qaeda scenario, we have fewer dots to connect. So these are fewer, in many cases, we're talking about homegrown violent extremists or ISIS recruits who are in contact with fewer people, so there's fewer dots that way, over a shorter period of time, so there's fewer dots that way, over simpler attacks, but still very, very deadly to innocent people, so fewer dots that way. So each dot becomes that much more important to be able to connect. And the idea of just blinding the agent by putting some restriction on his ability to see information that, again, and I can't underscore this enough, that we already constitutionally have sitting in our own databases, the irony of it is tragic to me.
Mm-hmm. How often, if you could characterize in an unclassified setting, does the FBI come across traditional criminal activity as a result of those searches? And then walk us through the process of what you do with that. If you identify, we'll go back to the individual taking photos of the Key Bridge, and it turns out it's not a terrorist attack, but he's planning to spray paint it, maybe, or do something that mars the property, and it's a crime, but maybe not a terrorist act. What do you do with that information in terms of that 4.3% holdings as it applies to 702, where a crime is identified? I'm not sure if my question's clear.
Well, I think there's some blurring there. So there's the information over here that the agent is seeing real time in the U.S. That's the tip or the lead. And then there's the information in the database, and it's the connecting that's important. Let me talk about what's in the database first and what isn't. What's in the database, that 4.3%, that's not evidence of garden variety criminal conduct. The only stuff that's in that is information about foreigners reasonably believed to be overseas for foreign intelligence purposes. So that's foreign intelligence information that's in there. That's not evidence of, I don't know, pick an example, child porn or something else. It could be very serious, but that's not what's in there. So the agent over here, if he's a national security investigator, is connecting something that he thinks of as national security information with foreign intelligence information. The criminal agent, who is not doing anything related to national security, he's not looking to try to find some national security hook for his case. He's just trying to make sure, let's say he's got a cigarette smuggling case. One of the things we know is that terrorist groups have used things like cigarette smuggling to finance their activities. There are cases that the Department of Justice has brought over the years on that very thing. Cigarette smuggling is a crime. Well, it could be handled one way, but if it turns out that cigarette smuggling that's designed to support Hezbollah, that's different, and needs to be viewed differently. But we won't know that if we just build a wall between the agent and the information that's sitting right over here in the FBI database.
So there's been discussion about adding an additional dimension in legislation about warrant and probable cause of going further. Can you describe for the audience what are we talking about in terms of warrantless and warrants when it applies to U.S. persons? So now we're in the U.S. persons end of the spectrum as it applies to 702.
Well, a number of things. First, let me start with, whenever I hear the word warrant, I think Fourth Amendment. And so remember, and I'm going to say this over and over and over again, every court to look at Section 702 and the way it's been used, including the FBI's queries, has found it fully consistent with the Fourth Amendment. And that makes sense if you think about it, because what the agent is querying is not some new search. He's querying information the FBI has already lawfully obtained. The second thing I guess I would say is, to me, when I hear warrant, probable cause, especially if you're talking about a warrant to be able to look at information that's already in our own databases that we lawfully and constitutionally obtained, that's those bricks in a wall. When people now sit back and say 3,000 people died on 9/11, how could the U.S. government let this happen? And one of the answers is, well, they had this wall. And then people say, how could there be this wall? Folks, right now, that's what we're watching. This is what building a wall feels like. Well-intentioned people, when there's no constitutional justification for it and no abuse to be remedied, thinking, well, what if we just put this one more restriction here, one more hoop there, one more restriction there, one more hoop there? That's what building a wall feels like. There'd be building a wall between the agents and what's in the FBI's own databases. Think about some of the hypotheticals and real-world examples I've just given today. That guy who sees the person taking pictures of the Key Bridge. He doesn't have, he's not going to be able to get a warrant based on that to search what's in the database. Think about the person at the store with what could be a precursor. They're not going to get a warrant. Think about an example, you know, one of the, maybe near and dear to a lot of our hearts. You know, high school student calls in, says my ex-boyfriend has been making all kinds of ominous comments about his admiration for various mass casualty attacks. And let's say he lists everything from, you know, the awful shootings in Connecticut all the way to like the Orlando nightclub bombing. And all she knows is that he's saying how much he admires those people. And he's got, let's say he's got a Twitter handle that sort of says like, I'm the angel of death or something. Horrible, scary, worrisome, not probable cause. No warrant. So that agent who gets that tip, he's out of luck. He can't look if he doesn't have that. If there's going to be a warrant requirement, he can't run that search. Now, maybe he could investigate. Maybe he would get lucky. Maybe over a period of time, he would hit pay dirt. I don't think we should be relying on maybes, and especially when there's nothing in the Constitution that would require it, and there's no abuse by anybody in law enforcement intelligence community under this program that would justify it. It's just choice, just personal, self-imposed choice. And when I say self-imposed choice, another version of that is self-inflicted wound. And like I said, I have enormous respect for the people who have raised some of these possibilities, like a warrant requirement. I know they mean well. I just don't think they understand the consequences of what they're asking for. Tips when they come in, some people will say, oh, well, you could do it. Maybe you'd have an exception for national security, but not if it's a pure criminal matter. Think about some of the examples we've talked about. When tips come in, they don't come in with a nice bow on the top that says national security, criminal. They're not labeled that way. It's not all the round pegs go in the round holes and all the square pegs go in the square holes. These pegs are coming in oblong. And we need to be able to figure out whether they're round or square. And that's what 702 enables us to do. So any restriction on our ability to access the information that's already constitutionally collected in our databases, I just think is a really tragic and needless restriction. And I beg the country not to go there again. I think we will regret it. And I'm hoping that it doesn't take another attack for people to realize that.
Right. And certainly in the kind of uncertain world that we live in, that's a distinct possibility of what our adversaries would wish to do to us. How is the decision on the 4.3 of the 702 data decided? Why isn't it not 10% or why isn't it 2%? What if you can elaborate on why is that so precise in terms of what's held that moves to the Bureau and not retained by NSA, let's say?
Well, the NSA still has it, right? So the way to think of that is the NSA has done all of this collection. And again, I want to stress, the NSA's collection is not bulk collection on anybody.
Exactly.
Not even foreigners. So they've got their collection. We're nominating certain email addresses to be included as part of what they collect. Because we only ask for that information when it is related to what is our highest level of predication for a foreign intelligence or national security investigation, that just has, I think, a narrowing effect on what it is we'd be asking for. So it's not that there's some magic percentage that we're seeking. It's just, I think, our own focus is what leads to it being a very small percentage, because we ask sparingly, surgically, and with emphasis on the proper focus. And you might say, well, gee, 4.3%, Chris, that doesn't sound like much, so why is this so important? Well, an easy way to answer that is think about how much havoc 19 people caused on 9/11. Think about how much havoc one person caused in Las Vegas. So you don't need very many people for it to be incredibly valuable. And I can assure you that 4.3% is very valuable to all the victims that could have been from that collection.
So thank you for elaborating on that. A question from the audience is, can you describe how the FBI uses 702 to fight cybercrime, which of course is a growing threat in its own right as you look across the spectrum of cyber security?
Well, I mean, cyber, of course, now spans across everything from what a lot of people think of sort of traditional hacking all the way to cyber, ransomware and various other kinds of activity. And it's used by everybody from nation states to non-state actors. There's cyber terrorism. But much like in the terrorism context, we're sending as taskings certain specific email addresses that we think may be tied to cyber activity that is related to a national security investigation. And then that may lead to, again, just like in the terrorism arena, we're getting tips got by the thousands, and we need to be able to figure out which ones need to be prioritized. So it's a similar concept than what I was describing in the terrorism context.
Right, and I think, Director, your observation about the information sharing, Admiral Rogers talked about the Russian cyber issue and the report from late last year that the community issued, and how important 702 in its generic form obviously could not give us details on that. But that information sharing that crosses the boundaries of foreign and domestic, I'm sure is of tremendous value, isn't it, in terms of seeing what NSA is focused on while you're addressing that as well.
And absolutely, that's true in a lot of different ways. I mean, just to pick an easy one to describe, lots of people are quite rightly focused on efforts by nation states to meddle with our election systems. Well, nation states are doing the same thing with other countries' election systems. The FBI doesn't investigate interference with the German election system. But if there's information that we're obtaining about what's happening there, that tells us a lot about tradecraft, methodology, and so forth. I was on the phone just before I came over here with one of my foreign counterparts in Europe. So that sort of comparing of notes is absolutely essential across all the different topics we talked about, whether it's counterterrorism, counterespionage, cyber, frankly, even outside the national security context. We're an interconnected world in a way that I think is more and more true every day.
Well, another question from the audience. Can you tell us about the minimization process and how is 702 information on Americans minimized? And what does it look like for the FBI in terms of getting access to it?
So minimization is jargon. It's a term of art. Minimization procedures are procedures that the FBI, in this case, we're talking about with the FBI, that we have approved by the court that allow us to, require us to restrict how we use information about U.S. persons in the take that we get, the intelligence information. And there's a whole, I can't describe all of them here because it's about 40 pages, but I think the main takeaway for the audience is these are protections for U.S. persons approved by a court. If you think about all this discussion that we had a minute ago about a warrant requirement, and should there be a warrant requirement? Well, what is a warrant requirement? A warrant requirement is a protection for a U.S. person approved by a court. That's what the minimization procedure, we have those. And they're, like I said, they're 40 pages, they're very detailed, they affect things like how long, if a U.S. person is incidentally collected, it affects, whether that information is redacted, masked in the information. It affects whether or not, how long the information is retained. Mm-hmm. It affects whether or not, you asked earlier about could it be used in a criminal case. It affects whether or not it can be used in the case. So all those protections are being fronted and reviewed by another branch of government, a court, a judge, a federal judge with life tenure Doesn't answer to me, doesn't answer to anybody in the executive branch, reviewing that with the independence that you get from judicial review. That's why the minimization procedures are important. We put a lot of effort into crafting those, making sure that they're going to pass muster with the court, and then adhering to them.
And then the training that goes with it for
right,
men
extensive
and women
training
that goes
Absolutely.
with that. I have a question that starts with, I'm interested in the process. NSA discovers intelligence via Section 702, and then FBI is made aware of this as a national security investigation. What happens then when NSA's made that discovery and then turns to the FBI? Is that a phone call? Is the data immediately passed? How does the process work by way of that information sharing? What's the interaction? How close are the communications between the two agencies before and during an ongoing investigation? 702 related.
Well, I mean, I think probably the short answer is all the above in terms of interaction between the FBI and the NSA. It depends on the particular circumstances. There could be phone calls, there could be emails, there could be other kinds of communication between the two agencies, if I understand the question correctly. I think that's...
Would the Bureau in this case, and now I'm adding to the audience question, place additional requirements on NSA for additional collection if it now moves into an investigation stage in terms of additional data, in terms of looking for 702? In other words, there might be new selectors because the investigation is clearly, hopefully, identifying additional dots as you've described them. So does then the Bureau reach back to NSA and say, here's some additional leads that we have, can you collect on that?
Well, yes and no. I mean, no in the sense that, remember, that the Bureau is only nominating selectors, which sounds like a legalistic term, but essentially making requests of the NSA in the context of national security, very specific kinds of national security situations. So I don't want anybody to get confused into thinking that the FBI, in an effort to build some kind of non-national security case, is enlisting the help of the NSA to build that case. That does not happen.
That's a very important point.
That does not happen. What does happen is people in the FBI identify maybe a new email address. They've started to pick up on somebody who's linked up to ISIS in some way, and they thought it was these 3 email addresses, and now they get a 4th or a 5th email address that's related to it. They might supply that information and say, can you have that in your collection? Can you collect on that email address as well?
Is there anything that you see in your tenure so far that 702 does not provide that you wish it did? So this is thinking more proactively. The last question I asked Admiral Rogers was, it took from 1978 to get to 2008 and then 2012. As we've seen technology change, obviously the copper wire of 1978 is largely gone by the wayside, unless we double pay for our handset as well as our landline. How do you sort of see the future by way of where this is going, which may be another way of asking the question of what you wish it would have, or we need to be ready to see that it should have in terms of this legal authorization that we're not thinking about perhaps in the way that the world is going?
Well, I think my very high-level answer to that question is we need to be trying to anticipate in a way that I'm still new, as you said at the beginning, enough to be able to really evaluate the ways in which technology is changing in terms of how people communicate. I mean, if you think about the ways people communicate now and how different they are from the ways people communicated 10 years ago, it's not hard to at least imagine and understand that it's going to be different again 10 years from now. The collection aspect of 702 is really Admiral Rogers' bailiwick, and I'm enormously appreciative and admiring of his work, and if he's already got a lead on that, I would defer to his expertise on that one. I think we're doing our best to try to figure out how we can be even more effective in using 702. My main focus right now is saying, folks, for God's sakes, please let's not take a step backwards, which is what some of these amendments would do.
Director Wray, thank you very much for this conversation and your opening remarks. We can only hope for the sake of the nation that we don't go backwards, having lived with the world of the 9/11 Commission and then the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004, and how vital and critical it was to move and hopefully stay ahead of where our adversaries go rather than go backwards. And as a career foreign intelligence collector, I can tell you we're in a much better place today by way of the two communities coming closer together with proper oversight, with due concern to privacy and civil liberties that the PCLOB itself has acknowledged in a report 3 years ago. And so with that, thank you very, very much for coming today and helping inform the public on this vital issue that has just a few weeks away from really coming to a head and hopefully renewed as is.
Thank you. And thank you to you and to Heritage for hosting this event, because it's an incredibly important topic that, as you can tell from the discussions you've already had today, doesn't lend itself well to sound bites and one-sentence descriptions. And there's a lot of confusion out there, and so having a thoughtful adult discussion about this is exactly what I think the country needs. So thank you for hosting it.
Thank you. Thank you.